That is a highly controversial topic.
It's not quite moral, but it is a theological explanation.
The idea of like apocalyptic literature is not that it's to be interpreted in necessarily a literal sense.
Yeah, I'm impressed by your very thorough research.
I just started thinking about this because, as you might imagine, nobody's ever asked me in church about Judas.
That's a fascinating philosophical discussion.
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe. Hello everyone, thanks again to those who are helping out on Patreon. The links are here and down below in the thingy. Once again, the questions are marked out in the YouTube timeline, so if there's a question in which you have a particular interest, feel free to skip ahead. If you have something to say about the topics we discuss here today, make sure you leave a comment. I really am interested in what you have to say. Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview, and make sure you stick around for the end where I tell you 2 things you probably don't know. Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Today my guest is Pastor Rob Woodrum of the Eastgate Christian Fellowship of Panama City Beach, Florida. Thank you for joining us, Pastor.
Thank you so much for having me, Franklin.
So were you born into the Christian church or did you convert?
Like others that you've interviewed before, I was born into a family that embraced Christianity. As a matter of fact, my father was a minister in the Methodist tradition for like 70 years. My dad was born in 1901, amazingly enough, and 60 years old when I was born. So I was born into a family that had embraced Christianity. I personally rejected that up until my 20s. And then I came to my own sort of crisis. Wasn't anything, not a huge deal. Wasn't off in jail or anything like that. I just felt such meaninglessness and purposelessness that I needed something beyond what I had. So nihilism wasn't going to work for me.
Why did you become a pastor? Besides it being the family business, so to speak.
Yeah, the family business. Yeah. No, see, that's the other thing. I came to faith a long time before I became a pastor. I was in my formative years. I didn't follow the denominational embrace of my dad. I went off on my own journey looking for how it is that I'd be able to express my faith. I got involved in an independent, charismatic church that was very abusive. I've affectionately come to call it the crazy church. I don't want to identify it necessarily, but it's gone now. So I feel comfortable enough. Leaving that, I still had a very deep, heartfelt faith and belief in Christianity and the tenets of Christianity. But I had a deep distrust of church simply because of my experiences there. A lot of damage was done to our family. And this is not to besmirch any of the churches that I was looking around trying to find a place in, but I just could not find my place. I couldn't. Every time probably because of the trauma, I kept extrapolating out, thinking, this is going to lead me right back into the same kind of situation. So we started a small Bible study. My neighbors and my family, we started going through the Bible in the crazy church. It was founded by a guy who had been a seminary professor in the Reformed tradition. So I actually I took theology classes and I had almost, I don't want to overstate that, but I had enough familiarity with theological premises and doctrinal perspectives that I was able to begin working my way through looking at the Bible and sharing what I was discovering with other people. So it started just as a small little group in my house and kind of developed from there. Just kept going. I was very happy with a very small community of people that we got to know and tried to figure out how to love God and love each other in the process. It's turned into more than that, but it's still a wonderful thing. I'm very stoked to be a part of it.
There's a schism within most of the major Christian sects involving what care should be shown to LGBT members of the faith. In the ones I've spoken to, I've noticed this within the Methodists, the Lutherans, and even the Presbyterians. Can you explain your position on this issue?
There's a lot of schisms, I would think, and I'm, in the samplings of the videos that I've seen that you've done, there's a large spectrum of viewpoints. schism is one of those things that the New Testament warns us to try to avoid, or like to try to work through and not have involve, infecting the community of believers. And care is something that we're supposed to be affording to every person, regardless of where they come from or maybe how an individual would view them. And it's kind of a bummer that we're running opposite of what it is I feel like the New Testament describes for us. And it's difficult.
Do you believe that we are currently in the end times?
I think what you're asking in that is, are we in the final days? Like, are we near the end of history as we know it and the culmination of all things, which the Bible does seem to be pointing towards, something like that. But I see a distinction between the end times and the final days. End times, as best as I can put together what the New Testament is saying, from the time that Jesus was crucified, rose from the dead, and ascended, that is, moved into the invisible realm of God, we have been in the end times. This is like, this is the stage. This is the stage where everything plays out. In terms of it being the final days, or are we at the end of that? I mean, because like end times, the guys that wrote the scriptures, they were expecting that any minute. They never envisioned 2,000 years of sitting around, somebody had to go back and sharpen their pencils and say, okay, let's think about this a little bit more. So it's lasted way longer than anybody would have anticipated that it would. But I mean, so like, are we in the final stages of that? I don't know. Most people who get wound up on that usually are using very localized information to make that determination. In other words, so here in the United States, the church, for most of our history, has enjoyed a lot of privilege. All of a sudden, cultural changes take place, the society evolves, the church doesn't find itself as privileged as it once was. And so the immediate sense of, this is it, this is the end of the world, they've all fallen apart. But I mean, man, you can go to other countries where there has been zero tolerance for Christianity, and people have suffered far greater things than we've ever even had come close to within this country. I'm sure they would think, well, you think yours is the end time. I think mine is the end time. I think we're in the. So I mean, I don't know. The world is it's a wild and a wonderful place, but it's always had ups and downs. And if you were to look at like the advances that we have now compared to sometime in history, like things are great right now. I've got a friend who's a doctor, and somebody was asking her, would you, if you had a time machine, where would you go? Anywhere in history? And she said, I would never go anywhere where they hadn't yet discovered penicillin. Because I mean, you think about how terrible the world was and the struggles that people had that we take completely for granted now. So, I mean, are things building towards something? I don't know, on a societal, on a localized level. Certainly, we're finding a level of crisis in the polarization, but even there, that kind of seems cyclical. Our nation's gone through these things before. Here's my thinking on it. I guess that's really what you're asking. I'm sorry, I don't mean to wax on and on, but I believe that whether Jesus returns, and that's something I believe the Bible represents, there's going to come a point in time where Jesus is, what that would look like, I have no idea. But Jesus will return. But whether that happens today or 10,000 years from now, my job description doesn't change. I'm called to love God and learn how to love my fellow human being. And that's a big enough task without me trying to figure out who the Antichrist is or something like that. So I stick with the job description I've been given, and all of that other stuff will pan out as it's going to pan out.
And well, I guess that covers that, but I was going to ask, what do you believe will happen in the end times?
So Revelation to me fits within what's considered to be apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic literature in its ancient context wasn't something that was a roadmap for the future. Apocalyptic literature was stuff that was written with imagery for oppressed peoples. So people who couldn't just freely talk had to use codes and symbols and things like that to try to communicate their displeasure or whatever. So in the context of Revelation, I believe what that's representing is not a roadmap for the future of the things that are going to happen, but it's highly complex imagery meant to convey the idea that, yes, it looks like Caesar is in control. It looks like he's ruining everything and, making our lives miserable. But behind that, something else is at work. God's actually working out a plan that's going to result in a world put back together the way it was intended to be. And that ultimately is what the Christian faith, what the good news is about. That we believe God has visited this world through the person of Jesus Christ with the intent of setting things right again, of bringing things back to paradise-like conditions, without war, without the pain that we know that is persistent in this world. So I don't necessarily think that Revelation is trying to, give us a hint like this, this beast over here is going to be this guy over here. I don't think it's that. I think it's talking in large brushstrokes. This is the way the governments of this world work. They're always going to be operating on this similar pattern, but take heart because God's kingdom is still at work and subverting that in beautiful ways. So
I would like to ask about the inerrancy of the Bible, using a specific example in Matthew 27:25. But at this point in the story, Jesus was arrested by the local authorities, and the crowd demands that he be executed. Pontius Pilate theatrically washes his hands and says, "I am innocent of this man's blood. It is your responsibility." And all the people answered, "His blood is on us and on our children." I'm comfortable saying they did not say this. There's no way they would phrase it as a group as a curse upon them and their children. I'd like to hear your thoughts on this, particularly given the rise of anti-Semitism recently.
Okay, yeah, that's great questions. Kind of three things at play here. First, let's touch on anti-Semitism. The rise of anti-Semitism. I think that you could legitimately look through the church, the history of the church, and find anti-Semitism raising its head in plenty of environments. So let me just make it very clear. I want to state this as plainly as I can. Anti-Semitism is evil. It's wrong. There is no excuse for it. There's no reasoning that can justify it for any reason, any sort of bigotry or prejudice or racism. All of that, based on the larger biblical narrative, is a sinful position. There's no getting around that, the damage that does and the harm that causes. And that's a horrible thing. So I want to make it clear that anti-Semitism is wrong and it should always be denounced. Any leader within any church worth the salt would denounce it. The other thing, as to Matthew 27, I'm someone who believes it's possible to read that. And I fully get what you're saying. I grant you that's a bizarre thing to have in there and wrought with things that could be very problematic just to read it on the surface level. But I believe that there's a way of reading that doesn't impugn the Jewish people, but actually condemns the religious and political machinations of that particular moment in that scene. One of the things that's hard to get when you're just reading the gospel stories is a sense of scale. We know that the group that was meeting in front of Pontius Pilate was definitively opposed to Jesus and anxious to see him executed. And they believed, I think they thoroughly believed they were doing God's work. They were doing what they believed God wanted them to do. Pilate, from the historical perspective on this, Pilate was in trouble as it was. He was in trouble with Tiberius. He was mishandling things in Samaria, had done a lot of damage. We know that in history, he gets recalled to Rome in disgrace later on. So he's got an issue at hand of trying to quell a riot. I don't look at him as being the good guy in this story at all. He's a politician. And as you said it perfectly there, he stages a bit of theater, washes his hands, trying to excuse himself more for Tiberius than for any other reason. The people that are there are not the Jewish people at all. There's not the larger Jewish community. In fact, we know that 6 days before that, Jesus comes into Jerusalem and everybody's mimicking what happened in the Maccabean revolt. They're waving palm branches and singing his praises. Well, those people didn't flip on a dime on Jesus. It's a different crowd. It's a different group that's there trying to push through their particular agenda. To call down a curse like that on themselves on a very localized, small group of people. And Pilate didn't need the whole city to be erupting. It only takes 2 to start a mosh pit. So he wanted to quell any sort of uprising, whatever was there. And so the people that are there, believing themselves to be doing God's work, are willing to call down that curse. In other words, we're so convinced we're doing the right thing, God can curse us if we're wrong. That's kind of like saying, may God strike me down if I do this. I don't necessarily believe that it was intended to be an impugning statement on the Jewish people as a whole. Thirdly, is the issue of inerrancy. And inerrancy is a problematic doctrine. The issue of inerrancy, of scriptural inerrancy, is a conversation that we've only been having the way we're having it now for about 100 years, a little over 100 years. Prior to that, you'll find people mentioning things in the ancient church fathers, or even through the medieval period of time, where it sounds kind of like the doctrine of inerrancy, but not the conversation we're having now. That's something that developed more as a response to the rise of modernism and its rejection of Scripture as having any sort of authority over society at large. The fundamentalists at the time viewed that as a threat. And so the idea was, we're going to use a modernist argument and prove that the Bible is infallible. It's perfect. It's, without error on any issue that it touches on. And therefore, we can prove that it can have authority over society at large. What that did, in my estimation, was demand that the Bible be something that it's not, or not intended to be. It required the Bible become a scientific manual. When it's meditation, it's Near Eastern meditation literature. It's meant to draw us in to better questions, not dole out the answers that then we impose on everybody else. Inerrancy is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. I would say that in 1978, about 200 evangelical leaders gathered together in Chicago and drafted their position, what they believed was the position of the church as it touches biblical inerrancy. And I think for those who hold to biblical inerrancy, that's the standard that's still used today. And their statement says that the Bible is of divine authority in all matters upon which it touches. It is to be believed as God's instruction in all that it affirms. But that leaves a huge amount of room for interpretation and differing opinions about that. Like, who determines what the Bible is affirming or teaching, and what's just part of a story? It's so complex, and there is no universal qualifier on it that the church is able to fall back on. So, like, a classic book from the Old Testament of Job, which, to me is a parable written about, human beings struggling with the discrepancies of what we think would be the law of retribution and the way life really actually works out. So Job says a bunch of stuff that's just terrible, that doesn't fit with the biblical narrative at all. His friends say a bunch of stuff that's terrible, that doesn't fit with the biblical. Well, if the Bible is going to be true on everything at every point, somebody's got to go in there and make a determination. Well, this is just part of the story, and we don't take that as inerrant or infallible. But this part is part of the story. You see what I'm saying in that? Professor Roger Olson says that the very definition of the word inerrancy succumbs to the death of 1,000 qualifications. And that is the problem with inerrancy. It paints us into a corner that we absolutely can't get out of without looking a little ridiculous.
I'd like to thank Pastor Woodrum for joining me here today, and I shall do so now. Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you so much, Franklin. This has been a real pleasure.
James Jackson was obsessed with healthy living. He suffered from poor health most of his life, but after receiving hydrotherapy at a spa in New York State, his health dramatically improved. So in 1858, he purchased a spa of his own, and over the next decade, it became one of the most popular spas in the world, seeing over 20,000 clients. But James had a much longer lasting effect on American society. In 1863, he developed Granula, which was the first manufactured breakfast cereal. This was soon copied by Kellogg's and called granola. Neither one of them would have approved of Cocoa Puffs. Here's the thing, satire is often missed, especially without further context. A good example of this is Schrodinger's cat. In this, a hypothetical cat may be considered simultaneously both alive and dead, as a result of its fate being linked to a random subatomic event that may or may not occur. Erwin Schrödinger never thought a cat could be both alive and dead, and he never tried this as an actual experiment on a cat. The thought experiment came from a conversation with Albert Einstein, and was meant as satire. It was a critique on the Copenhagen method of describing quantum mechanics, which I don't understand well enough to explain here. Thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.
Does that make any sense at all, Franklin? I'm sorry, I'm blathering.